Let's go back to some of those ideas about experimentation that we had talked about previously relative to groups like the AACM, right, and the Art Ensemble of Chicago. Well, a lot of the work that was occurring there actually starts to flourish into something different by the time we get into the 1970s, into the 1980s. And really, we can think of this as kind of like a progressive movement within jazz. And I'm bringing it up in this way because we're going to see that tension between artists wanting to push jazz in new directions versus artists who say, wait a second, we have completely lost our way. I mean, we've had, all this weird free jazz and we had fusion and then we ended up with smooth jazz. Let's go back to the way things used to be back in the 50s and 40s and 30s, because that's really what jazz was about. And so we're going to have this tension between kind of more conservative branches of jazz and then kind of more progressive aspects of jazz and this period of the 1980s. So the first one I'm going to talk about is what became known as the uptown scene, or also loft jazz. And essentially what we have here are a lot of those avant-garde experimentalists within jazz that we had talked about, such as, members of the AACM, and what they end up doing within the New York art scene in the 1980s. And so loft jazz largely consisted of a lot of these kind of free jazz explorations, but also combined with highly developed and complex compositional styles. So it wasn't all completely free. In fact, by the time we get into the 1980s, a lot of the musicians who are experimenting with free jazz said, well, we tried that, and we ended up with these kind of very specific types of improvisation. Rather than free jazz leading to, all sorts of different styles, it kind of became a style into itself. And so they're trying out new things through composition, allowing musicians to have improvisational freedom, but at the same time, also thinking about structure, thinking about complex harmony, thinking about composed melodies. Now, a lot of the places in which this is taking place was within New York, in these areas of the city that were essentially abandoned at the time. This area that became known as Soho. And we can kind of think about a similar sort of process of gentrification, if you will, as it has occurred here in San Diego, right? So I think of like the East Village area in particular. There is a lot of cultural activity, a lot of artists moved into that area. And so, you can go to, this experimental art scene, even though like right around the block is, these homeless encampments and things like that kind of, revitalizing certain spaces, but then also displacing a lot of people who were there. The same thing kind of occurs here. We have these abandoned lofts all throughout New York, and, a lot of people either start buying them up or just, asking to rent these spaces just for any sort of use whatsoever. And this was part of a broader artistic scene as a whole. There's any number of New York-based artists from around this time period, such as like Keith Haring, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and even to a certain extent Andy Warhol. They were part of this whole art scene that was connected to Soho. And he also had fashion. He had any number of different artistic styles. Jazz had a place within this whole sort of thing. Now, a lot of the concerts and the venues within this Soho scene were actually run by jazz musicians themselves. For them, this was the opportunity to create the environments they wanted for listening. So these wouldn't just be formal concert halls, right? Taking the classical music model, if you will, of some regal, lush space, right? And then just dropping jazz musicians in it, because it doesn't actually kind of work well, to be honest. The spaces are designed for orchestras, and they're reverberant. They ring out, that sort of thing, right? The Copley Symphony Hall downtown, it's meant for the sound to kind of hover in the air. You put jazz drums in there and it just kind of washes out. So instead, you have artists saying, well, these are the kind of spaces and the kind of vibe that they wanted for jazz, where they wanted people who are listening intently, but yet at the same time, it didn't have the trappings of other styles. And so, places like Ali's Alley and The Kitchen, these were important sites during this time period of this kind of Soho loft jazz scene. A lot of the musicians who are from this scene, they really kind of put forth this idea that what they were trying to do was to maintain the experimental aspects, like pushing jazz into new places. And yet at the same time, not getting hung up on the kind of stylistic limitations of any one style, whether we're talking about jazz, whether we're talking about avant-garde experimentalism, whether we're talking about rock music, things like that. And so for a lot of the musicians I'm going to talk about in this video and in the next video, this is pretty much going to be the kind of rallying cry, if you will, right? Experimenting, but also, challenging, the kinds of stylistic borders that keep musicians apart, and instead trying to bring musicians together to create something new ultimately. So the first one I want to talk about is this gentleman here, and this is kind of an older picture of Anthony Braxton, a saxophonist. And he works with any number of different saxophone styles. I love this picture of him playing a contrabass sax. I mean, quite literally the lowest saxophone there is, just because it's just this monstrous instrument. And it has this unique kind of quality to it, this unique sound that's unlike anything else. I mean, it's just a unique instrument altogether. But that's kind of Anthony Braxton's thing. He wanted to explore all sorts of possibilities of sounds, even though he had come from a background of working with, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, the AACM, and also fusion-oriented musicians like Chick Corea, that he could have, a place in different styles of jazz, as long as there was, for lack of a better word, rigor to what they were doing, that they were trying really hard to push those boundaries, to experiment and come up with interesting ideas. Now, he was highly influenced. He's still around, actually, I should say. He is highly influenced by a lot of the avant-garde jazz we had talked about, and also, too, classical composers. So, some of the avant-garde classical composers that we haven't really talked about in this class, but like Edgar Varese or Karlheinz Stockhausen, or, the whole European scene of avant-garde experimentalist music. He was very clued into that and very well aware of what they were doing. And he saw that those musicians were onto some interesting ideas worth adopting within the context of musicians who had jazz training, who were informed by jazz music. And so in that way, he is kind of crossing the boundaries between the jazz world, whether we talk including, free jazz and whatnot, but then also that experimental classical world. He's also a scholar too, so he writes quite a bit, and ultimately he comes up with what he calls the triaxiom writings. And what's really fascinating about this is it's partly music, but it's also this kind of statement about the universe and the way that all of these things kind of come together. He's a huge fan of chess and he makes this connection between the types of planning and strategies that goes into chess playing, and how in some ways that's very similar to what an improvising musician does. They have a trajectory, they have a goal, and they have to think about the steps they need to take to get there. But then also to be able to adjust to what their opponent is doing, or, in the case of music, what the other musicians are doing. How do you get from point A to point B through multiple strategies, multiple paths? How can you imagine how many steps ahead you need to be? Well, that's very much how he thinks about jazz, and how something like chess can really bridge those two worlds. And that's exactly what triaxiom writings are all about. It's about this kind of broader philosophy about how everything works. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about a lot of his music, and you can see from the score here, for those of you who read music, you're like, this looks familiar, but at the same time, it does not look familiar. And really what he tries to do is he creates these kind of works. He doesn't give them specific names, right? But they're really, in a lot of ways, more of these kind of guided improvisations. These ideas that, okay, I'm going to give you certain ideas that I want you to play, but then some things I'm not going to dictate the specifics of, because that's up for the musician to decide for themselves. So you can see here, we have this whole kind of score, and there are some very specific markings, right? There are some very kind of specific rhythmic dictations happening here, right? So we can see that, the kind of 6 against 2 polyrhythms. Next thing you know, you get a 7 against a 2 polyrhythm, things like that. These kind of groupings of notes that he's thinking of. And then we have these notes that have no rhythmic value whatsoever. That becomes something for the musicians to decide for themselves. And then we see these kind of squiggly line things, right? In a sense, it's saying, yeah, you want to kind of eventually hit these pitches, but your overall contour can be something like this squiggly thing. So it's not a, note for note instruction of what to play, but rather suggestions to get from point A to point B. You see some of the other unusual markings like the circles and the triangles and things like that. Well, these kinds of unusual notation methods were something that was well developed already within the avant-garde classical world. People were experimenting with this way back in like the 20s and 30s. But jazz musicians, not necessarily so much so. That's not to say that they didn't have their own methods of doing this, but not quite written out in this way. So to me, this represents that blending of the two styles. Some of his later pieces would actually take the approach that what number 322 was doing could be combined with a different work, like let's say number 24. And so he would actually have concerts in which you would have a sequence of pieces that were all being played at the same time. Different musicians had different pieces, or, they would go from one piece to the next. And so even these scores were themselves building blocks for larger works. Now, when you listen to this, you're not going to hear traditional swing. You're not going to hear traditional harmony. In a lot of ways, you'll probably say, well, this sounds a lot like the whole free jazz thing, but they're kind of doing the same sort of thing, but they're kind of not. That's the space in which he's really trying to investigate and see what's possible there. He's still active. He still performs, and he teaches through Wesleyan University, which is on the East Coast. And all the musicians that I'm going to talk about in this module, I believe, are all associated with universities. They're all associated with various colleges and institutions like that. And it's kind of interesting to think about that, like especially where the AACM started off. The AACM started off as this creative collective, but they eventually became a school for musicians. I might argue that that vision of music performance and music education is what's being continued on here. The next musician I want to talk about is another one of these people who, he developed his world within jazz, within performance, and now actually is an active professor at UCSD. Anthony Davis, I was lucky enough to work with him during my days as a graduate student. He's a pianist. Mostly nowadays, his work is primarily composition work. And he did a lot of stuff with people like Anthony Braxton and other artists who normally I would talk about, but given our compressed schedule, we weren't able to talk about Newton in this particular case. But really what I want to kind of get to are the ways in which he's thinking very broadly about what to do with jazz, this thing that he grew up playing. I mean, Anthony Davis, he grew up playing lots of society gigs and things like that, playing traditional jazz. He can do the stride thing really well. He's a huge, huge fan of a lot of the work of Charles Mingus. And every single time I took a class with him, we would eventually end up playing some Mingus tune at some point. And that's kind of what he was thinking of. He was thinking about these large spaces for improvisation and group interaction. But at the same time, he was trying to bring in new vocabulary. So in one particular case, he looked to the rhythms of Polynesian gamelan music. And I'll provide an example of Polynesian gamelan. It's a large orchestra that plays lots of these kind of bells and metal phones and things like that. And it has a completely different conception of how time works. Quite often a gamelan piece will start off slowly in these multiple layers of activity, and then it speeds up, and then it kind of dissolves again. Well, that's definitely not a typical jazz maneuver, but it's something that Anthony Davis likes to play around with quite a bit. More interesting is the way in which he starts to think about, well, how do I take jazz vocabulary and bring it into other realms? So working with large orchestras, traditional orchestras. And we would talk about this quite a bit. How do you make a classical orchestra swing? Because he was kind of thinking about that. Like, he wanted to hear those kind of grooves. He wanted that kind of rhythmic propulsion. But getting a large orchestra to do that is difficult, not only because of the sheer number of musicians, but also their training. They have a certain approach to how rhythm works that isn't the same in the way that a jazz musician might think of it. Well, regardless, his experiments ended up being extremely successful. He would end up scoring the soundtrack for the Tony Kirshner play Angels in America. This was one of the first works to deal with the AIDS epidemic in the United States. This is in the late 1980s, I believe it was. And his approach musically there, I think, is what gave that whole work, right, Angels in America, a sense of being very contemporary. It was very now. It wasn't a musical in the old sense of the word. It wasn't a soundtrack in terms of kind of like the kind of classical trappings, but rather it was pointing to the blended nature of culture, right? And that's really kind of what Anthony Davis is always shooting for in his music. Because of his success with Angels in America, he became really interested in large-scale forms, not just individual songs or albums, but how do you make a huge, cohesive work? And so this would bring him to writing a number of jazz operas. What do I mean by jazz operas? Well, it's basically thinking about jazz music, but then using the structural elements of opera. So what do I mean by that? Well, within opera, quite often you'll have a lot of repeated themes. A piece of music that gets associated with a character, that gets associated with an idea. What's often called a leitmotif, right? So this little melodic figure that every time you hear it, you think of a character. This is kind of a typical thing that we find in, like, let's say, soundtracks, right? Right, the Darth Vader theme. You hear that kind of hovering in the background, and it's supposed to make you think of Darth Vader, that kind of deal. Well, we can see this same thing, or we can see where it comes from within opera. So, using repeated themes, thinking about extended compositional forms, having a broader orchestral palette. And so quite often what he would do, what Anthony Davis would do, is combine a jazz group with the large orchestra and have those two things kind of bounce off of each other. In addition to that, a lot of the vocalists that he would choose to perform his works were trained in both operatic style and also in jazz vocal styles. They could improvise, they could think about how to groove in that sort of way, right? But then also have the big, powerful voices and the vocal dexterity that an operatically trained singer has. And so this is a listing of some of the ones that Anthony Davis came up with. X, an opera that was about Malcolm X. And this actually came out right around the same time that Spike Lee's film about Malcolm X came out. And it was kind of interesting, the tension between the two. He did an opera about the Amistad Uprising, which was kind of an interesting historical moment within the history of slavery, in which there was an uprising on a ship, and a trial ensued afterwards, and it kind of got to the heart of like how are we dealing with these people when we treat them as slaves. Another one called Tanya that was about, this kind of interesting moment of kidnapped socialite in the 1970s, I believe it was. Wakanda's Dream, Lilith, any number of different things. He looks to all sorts of different ideas as the inspiration for his operas, even one that was based on science fiction. But there's always that element of jazz within what he's doing. Jazz harmonies, jazz rhythms, right? And improvisation. That's an important aspect to almost everything that he does. Even Anthony Braxton played around a little bit with this idea of a large-scale operatic form with his work Trillium J. But really, it's Anthony Davis who has done the most work in this way, and was actually, he's received numerous international awards based off of these works. And hopefully, too, you're thinking, wait a second, I've thought of jazz before, but I never thought about the idea of a jazz opera. Well, this was, in the 1980s, 1990s, some extent still happening now. And to me, it speaks to the way in which jazz continues to grow. One more musician that comes from this Soho scene, this experimental scene, is George Lewis. George Lewis is primarily a trombonist and a composer and a programmer. He works a lot with technology and thinking about, well, where does technology, contemporary technology, fit within jazz practices? He was also the person who had coined that term Afrological versus Eurological that we had talked about a long time ago as well. His earliest work, he was a member of the AACM. And in fact, he actually not too long ago wrote a book, a kind of history of the AACM, and also Mahal Richard Abrams. And if you think about those two, if you think about Mahal Richard Abrams, you think about the AACM, the basis still was very much about experimentalism. Now, where he goes with this, I find, is always interesting. He's thinking about, well, what can a computer do in terms of improvising? Can we develop a computer system that can improvise like a musician, like a human? So, for instance, in 1979, as early as 1979, he had developed a program that he called the Kim and I, that was essentially a way of him improvising and having the computer respond in some sort of kind of simplified way in 1979. By 1987, he was working at a number of different institutions to kind of develop his programming skills and work with people specializing in computer music to develop systems that could not only just create music, but could analyze what he was doing on a trombone and then improvise against that. And this is almost kind of like an early attempt at artificial intelligence in a lot of ways. Artificially intelligent improvising system. He still plays around with this, and one of the more fascinating things that he's developed, that he's messed around with recently, was a performance that involved a series of robotic percussion instruments, just simple, drums and things like that, mixed around in a space with numerous microphones around the space. And this is all hooked up to a computer system that's meant to improvise. So he does something, and it kind of sets this machine in motion because a microphone picks it up, sends it to the computer, that sound is analyzed, and then one of those instruments in that space might respond. But then the microphone might pick up its own response and generate an idea off of that. Sometimes the idea might, like an improviser, it might echo what it's heard. It might provide a development on that idea. It might do something opposite of what it's heard. So if there was like a loud, slow banging sound, like bam, 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 it might respond oppositely with a very quiet and fast sound. Right? So not necessarily jazz vocabulary, but this idea of improvisation is really what's at play in George Lewis's work. And since then, he's written a number of really important essays and books dealing with improvisation and talking about how improvisation is like one of the most important human abilities. Our ability, and not just musically, but our ability to evaluate a situation and to respond to it is what makes us, a successful species in a way. In one talk that he gave, he talked about how, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and basically the entire government within the city of New Orleans kind of fell apart. I mean, really just everything went horribly wrong there. People had to improvise. They had to figure things out, and they did it collectively. Once they started to work collectively, that's where they found their comfort, their safety, despite the fact that, that none of the city's basic utilities and systems and, services were working. And, there was even horrible examples of like the National Guard telling people to like go back to their homes as they're walking on these highways. I mean, they're trying to escape the city on foot on a highway, and the National Guard is saying, no, turn back around. And they're like, we have nowhere to go to. Those kind of events are the things that George Lewis talks about in terms of improvisation and how improvisation is a survival skill. Well, that's quite a bit to talk about here. We're going to talk about another example, the downtown scene, to kind of juxtapose against this and deal some more with these ideas about progressive movements and experimentalism.